Below the velvet curtain of European history, the life of Marie Antoinette has always unfolded like a symphony both splendid and tragic, where the radiance of royal power blends with the shadows of accusation, prejudice, and political turmoil. This video will guide you through that entire journey, from her luxurious childhood in the Habsburg court to her final days in the cold cell of the conciergerie, so you can see not only a misunderstood queen, but a flesh-and-blood human being swept into the storm of her era. Together, we will peel back each layer of truth, unraveling the propaganda that distorted her image for more than 2 centuries, and uncovering the legacy she truly left behind. A legacy that reaches far beyond controversy and touches politics, art, and the way the world perceives women in positions of power. So relax, lean back, and let this gentle narration guide you into a quiet night, where history is no longer loud or chaotic, but becomes a soft, steady current, one that helps you drift peacefully toward sleep while understanding more deeply one of the most compelling figures humanity has ever known. As the night settles deeper and the final echoes of the introduction slowly fade, your mind begins to loosen and drift into a gentle quiet. And now, in this softened stillness, we step together into the first chapter of our journey. A chapter that returns to the very beginning, to the place where a little girl named Maria Antonia was born, a girl who would one day become one of the most controversial figures in European history. To understand Marie Antoinette, we must return to Vienna, to the gilded walls and the political expectations that shaped her life from the very moment she cried her first breath. Marie Antoinette was born in 1755 at the Hofburg Palace, the seat of power for the Habsburg Empire, one of the oldest and most influential dynasties in Europe. At birth, she was given the name Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna, a name long and weighty, mirroring the immense expectations placed upon her tiny shoulders before she even understood the meaning of freedom. Vienna at that time was not just the capital of an empire, it was the heart of European culture, music, art, and diplomacy. Within those grand halls glowing with candlelight, where balls and court festivities pulsed like the rhythm of royal life, Maria Antonia grew up amid a level of splendor most of the world could only imagine. But this splendor was not the indulgence of simple royal luxury. For the children of Empress Maria Theresa, each child was a piece on the chessboard of 18th-century geopolitical strategy. As the 15th of 16 children, Maria Antonia was destined from birth for a singular purpose, to serve as a diplomatic bridge, a living bond for alliances that protected Habsburg interests across Europe. Her childhood, therefore, was both magnificent and tightly bound. In the imagination of many, an Austrian archduchess must have lived among silks, dances, and soft music. And while that was true on the surface, it was only part of the picture. Beneath the elegance, Maria Antonia was pushed through a compressed education crafted to shape her into the perfect emblem of Habsburg royalty. Though she was not academically gifted like some of her siblings, she possessed a natural charm, a clear, sweet voice, and an effortless grace, qualities the Austrian court regarded as valuable political assets. Maria Antonia's world was one in which every step was watched, every gesture interpreted as a diplomatic message. When she played the harpsichord or practiced her early dance steps, it was not merely the enjoyment of a child, it was a demonstration that the Habsburgs could cultivate refined, desirable young women suitable for the most prestigious courts in Europe. If one were to speak of loneliness within luxury, then Maria Antonia's childhood embodied it. She was cherished, yet that affection came entwined with expectations. She was shielded, but her protection was a framework of duty rather than freedom. Contemporary writings often describe her as gentle, likable, and bright-eyed with a mischievous spark. Yet these records also reveal that she never fully understood the political weight of her position. She grew up amidst ceremony, but without a complete awareness of the responsibility attached to it. This innocence, rare among royalty, would one day leave her vulnerable amid the rigid, unforgiving world of the French court. When we look back on Marie Antoinette's early years, we see a profound paradox. She was born into abundance, yet her life was never truly her own. She was surrounded by Mozart's music, by grand celebrations and shimmering lights, yet within her lived a girl who had never been allowed to choose her own path. And from the very start, her future had already been sealed. A political marriage meant to mend the wounds of the 7 Years' War, a diplomatic mission assigned without a single question of her desire. For Maria Theresa, her mother, a firm and pragmatic empress, Maria Antonia was more than a child. She was a critical diplomatic opportunity. Austria and France, longtime rivals, required a symbol of reconciliation. And Maria Antonia, with her gentle nature, delicate beauty, and innate charm, was the perfect candidate. Not because she was prepared, but because she was useful. Thus, even as she played in the vast gardens of Habsburg, political reality waited patiently at the end of her path. Her childhood held none of the carefree lightness ordinary children enjoy. From the way she greeted others, to the way she stood, spoke, or smiled, every action was guided toward a single purpose, preparing her for the day she would be sent away, leaving her homeland behind for the sake of the empire. This preparation was meticulous. Maria Antonia had to learn French, the language of Versailles, despite her struggle with foreign tongues. She learned dance, singing, musical performance, and the refined manners expected of a future Queen of France. Yet, this preparation remained largely superficial. The Austrian court believed that grace and likability could compensate for academic shortcomings. As a result, Maria Antonia entered her future carrying gaps Versailles would never overlook. The most beautiful image from her childhood is perhaps of her running through the gardens of Schönbrunn, where fountains glimmered under gentle sunlight and peacocks wandered calmly across the grass. These were the rare moments in which she was simply herself, not a diplomatic tool, not a future queen, but a spirited child laughing freely. Yet such moments were as fleeting as petals carried away by the wind across the palace grounds. And as she entered adolescence, the decisive moment drew near. Austria needed to strengthen its alliance with France. France needed a youthful symbol to ease post-war tensions. The two courts needed each other, and Maria Antonia's fate was sealed by a marriage agreement she had no power to refuse. Thus, the childhood of Marie Antoinette, radiant and enchanting as it seemed, laid the foundation for a life marked by profound tragedy. Every aspect of those early years served as preparation for the role of Queen of France, a role she would assume while still little more than a girl. Her beginnings, filled with innocence untouched by political realism, became the first catalyst for the conflicts, misunderstandings, and sorrows awaiting her at Versailles. And now, as the night grows gentler still, we leave Vienna behind, its imperial lights gleaming softly in the distance, to enter a new chapter where destiny shifts suddenly. A journey that would change her life entirely, the journey that transformed Maria Antonia into Marie Antoinette, the young bride of the Dauphin Louis Auguste, in a marriage arranged by forces far greater than the private hopes of a 14-year-old girl. Leaving behind the golden gardens of Vienna, our story moves toward the first great turning point in Maria Antonia's life. As her childhood came to a quiet close, the young girl of the Habsburg Empire was asked to leave her homeland. And even the name tied to her earliest memories, to step into the role history would forever remember, Marie Antoinette, the arranged bride of Louis Auguste, the Dauphin of France. From this moment on, her life shifted onto a stage far larger, more perilous, and far more unforgiving. The next chapter is not merely about a royal wedding, but about the sacrifice of youth, identity, and freedom from a 14-year-old girl caught in the machinery of European politics. When Maria Antonia was told she would become the wife of the French heir to the throne, she was barely past 14, an age when, in Vienna, she still dreamt about grand balls, Mozart's melodies, and carefree laughter shared with her sisters in the palace corridors. But to the courts of Austria and France, she was no longer a child. She was a promise of peace after decades of hostility. She was a diplomatic bridge, a political offering meant to ensure that the two great powers would never again stand on opposite sides of a bloody battlefield like they had during the 7 Years' War. From that moment, everything in her life shifted. Her clothing, her speech, her posture, even the way she smiled, everything had to be reshaped to fit the mold of a future Queen of France. Vienna began to refine her not into the woman she wished to become, but into the woman Paris wished to receive. It was a preparation that never asked for her opinion, nor granted her a choice. The most defining decisions of her life were made by people who never truly knew who she was. The farewell to her homeland became one of the most poignant scenes in Marie Antoinette's life. On the boat crossing toward the French border, she was required to leave everything behind. Her family, her friends, Austrian culture, even the smallest keepsakes from her childhood. According to diplomatic custom, she had to surrender not only her belongings but also her identity. At the exact point where Austria and France met, she was stripped of all symbols of her Austrian origin so that she could be reborn as a Frenchwoman. It was a painful moment often remembered as a forced metamorphosis, when the girl Maria Antonia disappeared and Marie Antoinette was created. Not by desire, but by diplomacy. On the other side, France awaited her with ritual, etiquette, and one of the most rigid royal courts in Europe. Versailles shimmered like a dream, yet it was as harsh as a political labyrinth. And the man chosen to be her husband, Louis Auguste, would become one of the most uncertain elements of her fate. Louis Auguste was not the romantic prince of stage plays or novels. At 15, he was shy, inward-looking, fascinated by mechanics, and deeply absorbed in crafting locks. He had no experience with life beyond the palace walls. His personality contrasted sharply with that of Marie Antoinette, vibrant, social, and emotionally expressive. They did not meet through affection, but through the cold lines drawn on diplomatic maps. These differences soon hardened into distance. In her earliest days at Versailles, Marie Antoinette struggled to adapt to a court where even the simplest gestures, getting out of bed, eating breakfast, or changing clothes, were performed under the eyes of dozens of observers. She entered a world where privacy hardly existed. Every glance was cast upon her, not in admiration, but in judgment. Louis Auguste, though kind-hearted, was too timid and uncertain to offer the support she desperately needed. Then came the great problem of their marriage, the wedding night that did not unfold as the court expected. For years, their union remained unconsummated. This failure sparked rumors that spread like poison through Versailles. The French public, already suspicious of the young Austrian, began to blame her for everything: her inability to produce an heir, perceived frivolity, and supposed negligence toward France. Meanwhile, Louis Auguste sank deeper into self-doubt. The pressure of his future kingship and the silent scorn of courtiers pushed him further into isolation. Their political marriage, intended to unite two nations, instead planted the first crack in the foundation of Marie Antoinette's future suffering. Yet amid these pressures, there were moments of human tenderness. Louis Auguste was not cruel, nor indifferent. He respected his wife and, in the clumsy way of someone unfamiliar with emotional expression, tried to offer her some measure of stability. And Marie Antoinette, though young and at times impulsive, felt genuine empathy for her husband, a nuance history often dismisses. They were not a perfect couple, but they were also not the cold figures propaganda later painted them to be. It was within these contradictions, expectation and reality, politics and emotion, ritual and loneliness, that their marriage slowly took on the shape of tragedy. Marie Antoinette did not enter Versailles as a cherished bride, she entered as someone bound to obligations she barely understood. From a dreamy 14-year-old girl, she became the Dauphine watched relentlessly by the court, and eventually the symbol upon which the frustrations of France were projected. Her marriage to Louis Auguste had never been her choice, but it became the foundation for the misunderstandings, wounds, and storms that would engulf her life. It opened the door to the accusations history would later pin upon her: extravagance, immorality, and even treason, charges that drift far from the truth once we understand the complexity of her circumstances. And as we close this chapter, another opens. Beyond the glittering wedding lies the long, suffocating years inside the French court, where every step Marie Antoinette took was scrutinized, where the Austrian princess became the emblem of everything the French resented yet could not look away from. This is the beginning of the next stage, where whispers turn into rumors, and rumors into the tide that would eventually sweep her toward her tragic fate. After the lavish wedding that seemed destined to usher in a new era of happiness, Marie Antoinette stepped into the French court with a heart full of hope, yet shadowed by quiet anxieties. If her marriage to Louis Auguste was a symbolic bridge between two empires, then the days that followed were the true test, an initiation into a world entirely unlike the one she had known. And it was there, in that foreign world, that the difficulties of the French court began to close in on her from every direction. The Bourbon court of that era was not merely a center of power, it was a labyrinth of social rituals, rigid rules, and constant scrutiny. Versailles was not a home, it was a grand stage where every gesture and every step Marie took was measured and examined. Even the slightest deviation from court etiquette could become a subject of gossip that swept through the gilded halls of the palace. What overwhelmed her most were the morning ceremony and the bedtime ceremony, moments one might assume to be private, yet they unfolded before dozens of nobles of various ranks. The acts of dressing, taking breakfast, even drinking water. Every bit of it was transformed into ritual, complete with those permitted to participate, those excluded, those allowed to touch the queen, and those relegated to watching from afar. For a young girl raised within the warmth of the Austrian court, Versailles felt like a world of cold, expressionless masks, where sincerity was a luxury few could afford. Beyond the formalities, Marie had to navigate the intricate network of hidden factions in the court. The circle surrounding Madame du Barry, the powerful mistress of Louis XV, viewed her as a threat, while other traditional nobles eyed her with suspicion as the foreign princess. Any word spoken without careful calculation could be twisted into an attitude, an insult, or an excuse for political pressure. A girl barely 14, however intelligent and sensitive, could not possibly foresee all the traps hidden within the polished corridors of Versailles. The pressure grew heavier because Louis Auguste, her husband, was still a shy young man, awkward in conversation and hesitant in exercising authority. Marie was not only a wife, but also expected to be an emotional anchor for the future king. Yet she herself had not found her footing, she had not adapted, had not carved out a place for herself, had not fully grasped the expectations pressing upon her. Loneliness seeped into the lavish banquets, the elegant balls, and the grand public appearances, even as she maintained her gentle smile. Unable to integrate into court life, Marie sought escape in personal pleasures, vibrant fashion, light gambling among the nobility, late-night festivities, and eventually the Petit Trianon, a small, secluded refuge where she could breathe as a simple human being. But reality at Versailles was unforgiving. The very amusements that brought her comfort soon became fodder for political opponents, exaggerated and distorted until she was painted as frivolous and wasteful. Even though most of the accusations were overstated or entirely fabricated. The hardships within the court were compounded by the pressure to produce an heir. France waited for a successor, and all eyes settled on Marie Antoinette's womb. As months passed without a pregnancy, the criticism grew harsher. The young, sensitive queen became the target of merciless scrutiny. She was too young, too Austrian, too carefree, too obsessed with fashion, and incapable of bearing children. Those whispered judgments became an unspoken torment, pushing her deeper into isolation and into the small comforts she could still control. At the same time, France's financial state deteriorated. Poor fiscal policies, costly wars, and famine spread through the kingdom. Though Marie was not the cause, the court, and the public, found it easy to blame her, imagining a queen who lived in dazzling luxury, indifferent to the suffering of the people. And so her image became more distorted with each rumor, each slanderous pamphlet scattered across Paris. This period felt like a whirlpool, pulling Marie from a radiant young girl into a symbol of disdain, a symbol she herself could not understand. These hardships reshaped not only the views of the court and the public, but slowly eroded her spirit. Marie Antoinette, who had come to France with the hope of uniting two nations, now found herself struggling simply to maintain her position, her dignity, and her peace of mind. And from the pressures of Versailles, the next chapter of her life began to take form, a chapter filled with complexity, wounds, and upheavals that would not only alter Marie's personal destiny, but eventually shake the entirety of France. The mounting pressures within the Versailles court did not merely exhaust Marie Antoinette, they gradually pushed her toward the brink of despair. Just as the rumors, the scrutiny, and the tangled expectations had yet to subside, France entered a far greater storm, a crisis that stretched far beyond the reach of any single member of the royal family. And from this turning point, the tragedy of Marie Antoinette would blend into the tragedy of an entire nation. This was the moment when economic collapse and political catastrophe swept in, pulling her, along with millions of others, into a whirlpool from which none could escape. The financial crisis that gripped France in the late 18th century did not erupt overnight. It was the outcome of decades of reckless spending, extending through the reigns of earlier kings, fueled by costly conflicts such as the 7 Years' War and the support for the American Revolution. The royal treasury was hollow, public debt had climbed to near insolvency, and the tax system remained brutally unfair. The wealthiest classes, the nobility and the clergy, were exempt from most taxes, while the burden fell entirely on laborers and peasants. As the economy withered, the price of bread, the essential staple of French life, soared. Famine spread, and protests began to rise from the poorest quarters of Paris. The people were not only hungry, they were furious. And they needed someone to blame. Tragically, that someone became Marie Antoinette. Her image, already damaged by court gossip, now crystallized into a symbol of luxury and excess. The exquisite fashions, the late-night festivities, and even the peaceful refuge of the Petit Trianon, innocent escapes for a young woman seeking solace, were transformed into damning evidence. Though she had not caused most of the royal expenditures, the public increasingly believed that Marie was the one devouring the nation's treasury. Malicious pamphlets flooded Paris, exaggerated caricatures, entirely fabricated stories, and absurd accusations. Opposition politicians weaponized the figure of the foreign queen, adding fuel to the fire. They called her Madame Deficit, as if all of France's misfortunes had sprung from this young Austrian woman. The people's frustration was no longer a thin mist, it had become a fierce flame threatening to engulf the entire Bourbon dynasty. In this climate, Louis XVI appeared indecisive and timid. Financial reforms were blocked by reactionary nobles. Capable ministers like Turgot and Necker were dismissed simply for challenging entrenched interests. The divide between the monarchy and the nation deepened, and with every failed reform, the situation grew more hopeless. Marie Antoinette stood at the intersection of these tensions. As queen, she was expected to engage in political discussions, yet every action she took was twisted. If she remained silent, she was accused of weakness, of abandoning her duty to save the nation. If she voiced an opinion, she was condemned for manipulating the king, for wielding power in self-interest. Every path led to criticism. By this time, Marie began to grasp that France was no longer merely troubled, it was teetering on the edge of collapse. Hunger had eroded the people's trust in the crown. Enlightenment ideas spread, challenging monarchical authority. And behind the scenes, new political forces quietly gathered, thinkers, lawyers, deputies, and long-oppressed social groups who had finally found their voice. At every ceremony and public appearance, Marie felt the shift in the air. The admiring gazes once directed at her had turned to skepticism, and even hatred. The whispers in the crowd were no longer about the gown she wore, but about the price of the bread they could no longer afford. Faces that once greeted her with smiles now held only coldness. Worsening the situation was the monarchy's complete disconnection from reality. Versailles continued to host balls, maintain extravagant rituals, and preserve its comfortable isolation from the outside world. This distance made the people feel abandoned. And once trust had evaporated, every decision of the crown was viewed through a lens of suspicion. In an attempt to save the nation, Louis XVI summoned the Estates General in 1789. For the first time in more than 170 years. But instead of resolving the crisis, the event became the catalyst for political upheaval. The Third Estate, representing the common people, rose to challenge the traditional order, paving the way for the creation of the National Assembly. From that moment, everything spiraled beyond the monarchy's control. Marie Antoinette, though fully aware of the gravity of the situation, could not reverse the tide. Her decisions, whether well-intentioned or misguided, were dissected with merciless intensity. When she sought support from Austria, she was branded a traitor. When she urged the king to stand firm, she was labeled obstinate. When she remained silent, she was dismissed as useless. The economic crisis and political disaster were no longer confined to the court. They had become an undercurrent pulling the entire nation toward an age of revolution. And in the heart of this turmoil, Marie Antoinette, once admired for her beauty and charm, was recast as the very embodiment of decay and corruption, though the truth was far more complex. From personal pressures, she had been swept onto a far larger stage, one where the fate of millions shifted by the day. And from this point forward, the tragedy of Marie Antoinette entered its darkest chapter, when the French Revolution began to take its full shape, and the bond between monarch and people stretched to the breaking point. As the storms of finance and politics continued to spiral, sweeping away every desperate effort the royal court could muster, France approached the outermost edge of its endurance. The sighs born of famine, the furious pounding on palace doors, the accusations hurled toward the monarchy, together, they merged into a single foreboding sound, a warning of an impending collapse that could not be reversed. And it was in this very moment that history shifted. The Bourbon dynasty was no longer facing a simple crisis, but an upheaval capable of shaking the very foundations of a monarchy that had endured for centuries. This was the moment France stepped into the age of revolution, and Marie Antoinette became the target of every pointed spear. The French Revolution did not erupt solely because the economy had deteriorated, it came because the people had utterly lost faith in royal authority. Enlightenment ideals, championing liberty, equality, and the sovereignty of the people, had spread quietly yet decisively, turning resentment into action. The Estates General was convened in the hope of resolving financial deadlock, but instead of restoring stability, it opened the door to a new political order, one in which Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette found themselves unable to adapt. The creation of the National Assembly challenged the king's authority in full view. At Versailles, Marie Antoinette felt the change in the very air around her, the festive spirit faded, replaced by the cold, measured gazes of the increasingly empowered Third Estate. From the palace corridors to the streets of Paris, people discussed constitutions, liberty, and the rights they believed were theirs by birth. To her, this new reality was both strange and terrifying, for never before had the role, and very existence, of the monarchy been placed so directly on trial. On July 14, 1789, the signal flare of revolution burst forth as the Bastille fell. The event marked more than the destruction of a symbol of imprisonment, it was the people's declaration that they no longer feared the king's power. And once the people cease to fear, the monarchy ceases to be safe. From that moment, Marie Antoinette was no longer seen as a queen, but as the embodiment of the old order, everything the people believed must be torn down to reclaim their freedom. Not long after, rising tensions swelled into violent waves. On October 5, 1789, thousands of Parisian women, angered by soaring bread prices and disillusioned by the court's indifference, marched to Versailles. What began as a protest soon transformed into an eruption of collective fury. They stormed the palace, shouting for the queen, smashing furnishings, and forcing the royal family to leave Versailles and move to Paris under armed escort. From that moment forward, Marie Antoinette became a prisoner within the very nation she once ruled. Within the Tuileries Palace, the royal family lived under constant supervision. Every movement, every whisper, every gesture was watched. Marie Antoinette, who had once known only grandeur and ritual, now lived beneath the weight of unending anxiety. The cold stone walls of the Tuileries seemed always to echo with the murmurs of Paris, accusations, threats, reminders that their dynasty was dying. The Queen's presence in the Tuileries became a magnet for political propaganda. Anti-monarchists painted her as a traitor, an Austrian hand meddling in French affairs. Meanwhile, even the more moderate viewed her with pity, a woman trapped in the storm of her era, losing power piece by piece, yet unable to relinquish her sense of duty. The revolution drove the monarchy into a narrowing corner. Riots, parliamentary debates, and the relentless pressure of newspapers and incendiary pamphlets turned Paris into a boiling cauldron. Step by step, the king's authority evaporated, and with it, the queen's image grew increasingly fragile. What made this period tragically decisive was Marie Antoinette's inability to fully grasp the intensity of the revolutionary movement. She believed that order would eventually return, that the people were merely caught in a moment of anger. But this was a fatal illusion. The people no longer wished to repair the old system, they wished to destroy it. And the one standing at the heart of the storm, seen as the symbol of privilege, was none other than her. During the long, sleepless nights at the Tuileries, Marie began writing letters to the Austrian emperor and to Europe's noble courts, hoping they would intervene to save the Bourbon dynasty. These letters were born of desperation, yet they were perceived as acts of treason. Every plea for aid became proof, in the revolutionaries' eyes, that she was an enemy of the people. Pressure from the Legislative Assembly intensified as suspicions grew regarding the royal family's ties to foreign powers. Any action Marie Antoinette took, no matter how small, was interpreted in the worst possible light. If she remained silent, they claimed she was plotting. If she spoke, they accused her of manipulating the king. And if she appeared anxious, they believed she feared losing the throne. There was no path to safety. Meanwhile, the revolution fractured into rival factions, all of which viewed the monarchy as an obstacle. Demonstrations grew more violent. The weight upon Louis XVI became unbearable. And within this atmosphere, Marie Antoinette sensed that the danger was no longer about policy or economics, it was about the very redefinition of power. The French Revolution was not merely a period of national upheaval, it became a mirror reflecting Marie Antoinette's inner world. Faced with rapid, unforgiving change, she struggled to project strength while drowning in quiet despair. Yet even in her darkest moments, she never abandoned her role. She stood beside Louis XVI through every meeting, every ceremony, and in the eyes of many, she appeared stronger than the king himself. France's transformation was also the transformation of Marie Antoinette's destiny. A queen once adored for her grace now confronted an enraged populace, a woman once surrounded by luxury now weighed every step with caution, a figure once near absolute in influence now reduced to a symbol dragged helplessly through the gears of political fury. And as the revolutionary storm continued to swell, Marie Antoinette finally felt the truth she had long refused to acknowledge: there was no turning back. The road ahead held only tempests. And from this point forward, her life would descend into its darkest chapters, where escape became the final hope for survival, marking the beginning of a tragedy the world would never forget. When the pressures of the revolution tightened further and every door around the royal family began to close, Marie Antoinette understood that something had to happen, something more decisive, more daring, and carrying the final hope for her family's future. This was no longer a matter of power or the prestige of the Bourbon dynasty, it was the survival instinct of a mother, a woman, a human being pushed to the very end of her fear. And in that moment, the long-smoldering plan to flee Paris became the lifeline she and King Louis XVI felt compelled to grasp. From that instant, history moved straight toward one of its most tragic turning points, the failed escape at Varennes. Life inside the Tuileries was like living in a gilded cage. Outwardly there were still ceremonies, guards, and titles, but every movement existed under suffocating surveillance. Marie Antoinette could no longer move freely, receive guests at will, or influence state matters as she once had. This subtle imprisonment was justified by the revolutionaries as a way to safeguard the will of the people, yet for the royal family, it was a harsh reminder that they were little more than shadows of their former selves. With each passing day, the situation grew more perilous. Parisian crowds became increasingly radical, revolutionary newspapers attacked the Queen relentlessly, and pamphlets depicted her as a destroyer of the nation, an Austrian agent, even the mastermind of sinister plots to strangle freedom itself. These narratives not only shattered Marie Antoinette's dignity, they made her life, and the lives of her family, fragile beyond measure. In the dim corridors of the Tuileries, whispered discussions began. Marie Antoinette became the strongest voice urging escape. Unlike the hesitant, conciliatory Louis XVI, who still clung to the hope of reconciliation, she understood that dialogue was no longer possible. The new assembly needed only a single pretext to strip the king of all remaining authority. Staying meant waiting for death. She wrote to Austria, sending coded messages to royalist allies across Europe. These letters, carried by secret intermediaries, revealed both her desperation and her unwavering resolve to save her family. Amid these exchanges, a bold plan took shape. The entire royal family would leave Paris, head for the eastern border where loyal troops remained, and from there negotiate with the assembly from a safer position. This plan would be remembered as the flight to Montmedy. But history now knows it by another name, the flight to Varennes. On the night of June 20, 1791, as Paris drifted into sleep, the royal family began their escape. It was a long night thick with tension, soft footsteps in the dark, the creak of a barely opened door, whispered fears hanging in the air. Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI carried with them a quiet hope for restoration, but also a heavy dread, for they knew that if they failed, the cost would be unimaginable. The plan, already complex, was plagued by mishaps from the start. The chosen carriage was too large and too conspicuous. The children grew tired and cried. The soldiers assigned to assist them arrived late. The royal family departed hours behind schedule. These seemingly small missteps, like pieces of a tragic mosaic, slowly moved them toward the edge of catastrophe. Near the town of Varennes, just a short distance from the rendezvous point with loyal forces, fate turned sharply against them. A local postmaster and innkeeper recognized Louis XVI from the very face stamped on French currency. Suspicion spread. Villagers gathered. The carriage was halted. No violence was needed, no clash of arms, only the simmering distrust and long-nourished resentment of the people. The escape ended instantly. When captured, Marie Antoinette displayed a calm almost icy. It was not the absence of fear, but the presence of understanding. In that instant, she was no longer the Queen of France. She was a mother watching the future of her children slip into a darkness with no path out. The forced return to Paris became a public humiliation. Along the entire route, crowds lined the roads, hurling furious stares, curses, and bitter jeers at the slow-moving carriage. No one forgot that the royal family had tried to flee the nation at its moment of greatest chaos. No one gave them the chance to explain. From that moment forward, Louis XVI was not a flawed king but a traitor. And Marie Antoinette was no longer a suspicious foreign queen, she was the living emblem of treason. The failure at Varennes was the final blow to the fragile trust between the monarchy and the people. It destroyed what remained of royal legitimacy, turning Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette from weakened political actors into enemies in the eyes of Paris. The Assembly, already deeply skeptical, acted swiftly to strip more power from the crown. From here, the Bourbon dynasty did not merely weaken. It began its irreversible collapse. But what made Varennes so tragically significant was not simply political or military defeat, it was the shattering of the last hope the royal family possessed. It was the moment Marie Antoinette saw the final door to life slammed shut. And in that instant of ruin, she understood that every step that followed would be a battle to preserve dignity in an age determined to erase everything she represented. After Varennes, Marie Antoinette was no longer a woman terrified into running. She grew more resolute, sharper in her judgments, yet profoundly lonelier. She now faced not only political violence but an unerasable stigma in the hearts of the people. And as time pressed forward, the memory of Varennes became a turning point carved in stone, pushing the Bourbon monarchy unavoidably into the deepening shadow of total collapse. When the carriage carried the royal family back to Paris after the humiliating failure at Varennes, the furious shouts of the crowd felt like blades slicing through the last fragile layers of royal prestige. If before that night Marie Antoinette still believed that power, negotiation, or even the affection of a portion of the people might save her family, then after that fateful moment she understood that every door had closed. And from that point forward, France entered an irreversible trajectory, the downfall of absolute monarchy. From here, the story of Marie Antoinette was no longer merely the tragedy of a woman driven into a corner, but the distilled symbol of an age tearing apart its old foundations to build a new order, bloodier and more violent than anything that came before. As the monarchy crumbled, Marie Antoinette became the focal target of a fury fueled by decades of poverty, resentment, and wounded pride. When the Constitution of 1791 was enacted, the constitutional monarchy appeared to be the final fragile bridge connecting the crown and the people. But the flight to Varennes shattered that bridge. In the eyes of the public, the king and queen were no longer symbols of extravagance alone, they were traitors. She was no longer simply Madame Deficit or the Austrian she-devil of slanderous pamphlets, she became the embodiment of everything the revolution wished to destroy. Under pressure from radical factions such as the Girondins and the Jacobins, the Legislative Assembly passed measure after measure aimed at stripping the crown of its remaining power. With astonishing speed, whatever respect lingered for the royal family dissolved. Parisians who once watched Antoinette's processions now hurled insults at her face. This shift was not arbitrary, it was the product of a society long suffocated by inequality and privilege. The people needed a name to carry their rage. And that name was Marie Antoinette. The situation grew more merciless as the Tuileries Palace, where the royal family lived under luxurious confinement, transformed into a political battleground. Outside, meetings, speeches, and riots erupted without pause. Inside, despair settled into every breath. Marie Antoinette, who once hosted glittering soirees in Versailles, now lived surrounded by guards, stone walls, and an unrelenting fear. Every step she took was monitored. Every letter she sent risked interception. Even her loyal attendants were gradually replaced by revolutionary agents. But the deepest wound was not fear, it was helplessness. Antoinette knew the monarchy was standing on the edge of collapse, yet she no longer held any instrument of power. She could not sway Louis XVI, a gentle but indecisive man paralyzed by caution. She could not rely on Austria, whose leaders faced their own international turmoil. She could not influence the Assembly, fractured by internal conflict. All she possessed was her resolve, fierce, proud, but utterly powerless before the tidal wave of revolution. Then came August 1792, when the sans-culottes stormed the Tuileries. Everything ended. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The Swiss guards, loyal to their final breath, were cut down mercilessly. The palace became a field of blood. The royal family fled to the Assembly for protection, a humiliation unprecedented in French history. There, their authority was stripped away. Louis XVI was suspended. The monarchy was abolished. From rulers of the nation, they became prisoners. In the months that followed, Marie Antoinette entered the darkest chapter of her life, the descent into imprisonment. At first, she was confined with her husband and children in the Temple Tower, a cold, damp fortress with none of the grandeur of royalty. The harsh conditions quickly wore her down, her face grew hollow, her hair grayed, her steps slowed as if bearing the weight of an entire century. Yet these changes were not caused by time alone, but by a deeper agony, the anguish of a mother watching her children live in fear, deprivation, and stolen childhood. Isolation became the revolution's most cruel weapon. Antoinette was cut off from friends, attendants, and eventually even her husband. Louis XVI's trial and execution in January 1793 carved the final wound into her spirit. Their marriage had never been a great romance, they had endured distance and misunderstanding. But in their final years, they became one another's only refuge amid the storm. On the day he was executed, Marie Antoinette showed no tears before her guards. But people whispered that her hair turned white overnight. As the revolution entered its most radical phase, her fate plunged further into darkness. By late 1793, Marie Antoinette was torn away from her children entirely and transferred from the Temple to the Conciergerie, the infamous gateway to the guillotine. If the Temple had been a realm of loss, the Conciergerie was an abyss of despair, where death lingered at the threshold. There she was no longer a queen, no longer a symbol of decadence, but merely prisoner number 280, a frail woman confined to a damp cell, watched every hour of the day, deprived of privacy, sunlight and hope. In that place, Marie Antoinette was stripped of every title, every illusion, until only a solitary human being remained, one standing face to face with an unforgiving destiny. From there, her path led directly into the most sorrowful chapter of all, the one the world would remember forever. The final trial and the waiting blade of the guillotine. In the heavy darkness of the conciergerie, Marie Antoinette's story entered its final act, where the glory of her past, the despair of her present, and the uncertainty of her future merged into a tragedy no force on earth could reverse. During her days in the conciergerie, not only was Marie Antoinette's body worn down, but the final threads connecting her to the world she once inhabited were quietly severed. From a queen who once walked upon the marble floors of Versailles, she became a faint silhouette confined to a damp stone cell, reduced to shallow breaths and a will slowly being buried beneath the weight of despair. Yet within that suffocating darkness, her life was quietly shifting toward its final chapter, one that all of Paris had been waiting for, a trial staged not to seek truth but to carry out a sentence written long before she ever stood before her judges. And from the ruin of a monarchy, her story moved into its most tragic passage, the moment Marie Antoinette faced revolutionary justice, or, more precisely, the merciless machine known as the Revolutionary Tribunal. When Marie Antoinette was led out of the conciergerie on October 14, 1793, Paris seemed to hold its breath. The Revolutionary Tribunal, notorious for its severity and lightning-fast judgments, regarded her trial as a symbolic act. A cold message sent to anyone who still clung to memories of a fallen crown. There would be no objectivity, no earnest search for truth. What unfolded was a vast stage on which prosecutors had rehearsed their roles, while Marie Antoinette, frail, diminished, her hair now silver, became the figure upon whom layers of accusations were hurled like shards of broken glass. The charges were fantastical, yet devastatingly effective. Conspiring against the nation, plotting with foreign powers, squandering the treasury, and even horrific fabrications such as corrupting the young prince. That final accusation, crafted by Hébert and the extremist factions, was the cruelest blow, designed to ignite the fury of the public. But when she heard it, Marie Antoinette did not collapse. She stood straight, lifted her gaze toward the hall, and answered with a sentence that left the room frozen. Every mother would deny such vile accusations. In that moment, even her fiercest enemies felt something deeply human break through the hostility. Marie Antoinette was not merely a queen, nor just a political symbol, she was a mother defending the last fragment of her children's dignity. Some women in the audience wept. Yet that flicker of empathy vanished almost as soon as it appeared, swallowed by a courtroom determined to deliver only one outcome. For 2 days, she endured relentless questioning, attacks that felt more like personal humiliation than legal inquiry. She had no true lawyer, only a court-appointed defender powerless against the machinery of revolution. Her meals were meager, her sleep fractured, her health fading. But throughout the trial, she maintained the quiet, austere composure of a daughter of the House of Habsburg. She did not beg. She did not scream. She did not offer frantic justifications. She answered steadily, deliberately, as one who already knew her fate had been sealed long before she entered that chamber. And at 4 p.m. on October 16, her sentence was declared, death by guillotine. No one was surprised. No one protested. There was no pause for mourning. For the revolutionary leaders, the verdict was necessary, a final severing of the old order. For the crowds of Paris, it was the long-awaited triumph. And for Marie Antoinette, it was the final punctuation mark on a life twisted into a symbol of political disasters far beyond her control. The night before her execution, she wrote her final letter to Madame Elizabeth, the king's sister. She did not complain. She did not curse her enemies. Instead, she wrote of her children with quiet suffering, of her calm acceptance of death, and of her plea for Elizabeth to care for the little ones who would never again know an ordinary life. The letter never reached its intended recipient, yet it remains the last testament of a woman who endured so much pain in silence. On the morning of October 16, when the guards entered her cell, Marie Antoinette was ready. She wore a simple white dress, not as adornment, but because white was the mourning color of French queens. Her hair was cut short to make way for the blade, a final ritual of humiliation. Her hands were tied, and she was led out not in a closed carriage like Louis XVI, but on an open wooden cart, the kind reserved for common criminals. The road from the Conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution was packed with people. They shouted, taunted her, hurled insults meant to wound. But Marie Antoinette never lowered her head. Throughout the journey, she kept her gaze fixed ahead, refusing to engage with the bloodthirsty crowd. Her composure stunned many. Some whispered that she walked not like a condemned prisoner, but like a queen ascending to her final ceremony. As she stepped onto the scaffold, she accidentally trod on the executioner Sanson's foot and spoke her final words, "Forgive me, sir. I did not mean to." It was not the voice of a sovereign issuing commands, but the soft apology of a well-mannered woman whose innate grace could not be stripped away, even at the edge of death. A few heartbeats later, the blade fell. And the head of Marie Antoinette, the last queen of old France, dropped into the waiting basket as the crowd erupted in thunderous cheers. Her death closed an era, but not the debates that followed. To some, she remained the emblem of excess and decay. To others, she was a victim of circumstance, consumed by political forces she never truly understood nor controlled. But wherever one stands in the river of history, it is undeniable that the trial and execution of 1793 transformed Marie Antoinette into one of Europe's most tragic figures, a woman whose life, death, and legacy were shaped by the violent tides of a world remaking itself in fire and blood. The guillotine ended Marie Antoinette's life in an instant, but it could not sever her story. As the roar of the crowd slowly faded and Paris sank into the chilly afternoon of an October day, something else began to rise, the silence of history, a silence that always opens the door for reconstruction, reinterpretation, and the battle over memory. Her death appeared to close the chapter of a despised queen, yet in truth, it marked only a comma, the beginning of a journey that would stretch across more than 2 centuries. The journey of Marie Antoinette becoming a timeless symbol, reborn again and again through media, art, politics, and endless discourse. From here, we step into the most significant part of the story, her historical legacy. In European history, few figures have had their image distorted as profoundly as Marie Antoinette. She embodies a paradox, a real woman, with real flaws, real sorrows, and real limits. Yet one whom history transformed into a mythic symbol, reshaped according to the needs of each era. Even during her lifetime, she became the target of propaganda, revolutionary newspapers, slanderous pamphlets, obscene illustrations, all joining forces to create the wicked queen, Madame Deficit, the supposed destroyer of France. It was a portrait not of the real woman, but of a nation's rage, sharpened by economic crisis and political hatred. Yet the moment she was executed, her image began to shift. In the Romantic literature of the 19th century, Marie Antoinette was no longer the emblem of extravagance, but a victim of a revolution spiraling beyond control, a woman crushed beneath the wheels of history. Writers such as Alexandre Dumas, Stefan Zweig, and later historians spoke of her with sympathy, viewing her as one of the great tragedies of an age in which an individual paid the price for the collapse of a rotting political system. One of the most remarkable aspects of her legacy is her continual rebirth in popular culture. Cinema turned her into a fashion icon, Hollywood highlighted her innocence swallowed by political turmoil, opera and ballet elevated her as a symbol of fragility and pride. Marie Antoinette has inspired hundreds of works across painting, music, literature, and couture. The towering hairstyles, voluminous gowns of Versailles, and her radiant yet uneasy smile have become aesthetic emblems inseparable from the image of pre-revolutionary France. Yet her enduring appeal does not lie in beauty or opulence, but in the psychology of a woman thrust into the center of forces far beyond her control. She embodies timeless questions: how can public opinion destroy a person? How does power turn an individual into the symbol of all a nation resents? And how ruthless can history be in rewriting a human being? These questions ensure that Marie Antoinette never disappears from the collective imagination. Politically, her death struck Europe so forcefully that royal courts across the continent used it as evidence of revolutionary cruelty. She became a martyr for monarchists, praised for her composure in the face of execution. This helped shape a wave of counter-revolutionary sentiment throughout Europe. Many statesmen feared her execution had set a dangerous precedent: if a queen could be killed, then no one was safe. Conversely, early French republicanism embraced her death as an achievement, a declaration that power no longer belonged solely to those of royal blood. These conflicting interpretations coexisted, collided, and together formed a legacy too complex to be reduced to simple labels of right or wrong. Her legacy reached into the realm of feminism as well. Scholars have long asked, why was a woman who held little real political authority blamed so violently? The answer often lies in gender analysis. Women were not permitted political influence, and when they appeared to possess it, even in public imagination, they became targets for punishment. In this sense, Marie Antoinette stands as a classic case of gendered scapegoating, a woman held responsible for the failures of an entire system. Another crucial element of her legacy is the transformation in how we understand media and power. The affair of the diamond necklace demonstrated how reputation can be destroyed through rumor alone. In an age without social media, the pamphlets, caricatures, and whispered tales of the time were enough to obliterate her public image. Modern media scholars treat her case as an early example of mass communication manufacturing political reality, where truth is distorted to serve power. Her legacy continues to evolve in the imagination of later generations. To some, she remains a symbol of extravagance, detached from the suffering of ordinary people. To others, she is a young woman thrown into a political inferno, battling loneliness, pressure, and impossible expectations. This multiplicity ensures that history can never settle on a single verdict. Moreover, Marie Antoinette today is often seen as an emblem of spiritual strength. The image of her at the scaffold. Her hair white, her frame fragile, but her gaze unwavering, has become a symbol of dignity in tragedy. Few meet death with such composure. Even fewer become legends with a single final phrase, a gentle, human apology uttered at the edge of oblivion. Perhaps the most enduring part of her legacy is the question she leaves behind: are we judging her by the truth, or by the myths crafted over centuries? Is our perception of her the result of careful historical reconstruction, or the repetition of prejudices born 200 years ago? And most poignantly, will the real woman behind the symbol ever be fully heard? Marie Antoinette is gone, but her story is not. It continues to be rewritten by every reader, every historian, every film, every retelling. And it is precisely that, her ability to live on in the world's imagination, that forms her eternal legacy. As the story of historical legacy slowly comes to a close, one cannot help but wonder, after everything that has happened, after the rises and falls of fate, and after the layers of time have settled upon every trace, what truly remains to connect the past to the present? It is precisely at that moment of transition that Part 10, the final message, emerges like a quiet whisper, yet one that echoes endlessly in the mind of anyone who seeks to understand this story. History, at its deepest level, is not a lifeless collection of timelines or dry chronicles. It is the echo of human beings, with their aspirations, their mistakes, their courage, their frailties, and at times, their irredeemable tragedies. When we look back at the entire journey we have just traveled, from the shadowed social backdrop to the downfall of power, from the trials that sealed destinies to the legacy that lingers from an entire era, what remains is not merely the tale of one individual or one dynasty, but a warning for us today. That message, though never formally written, lives within every small detail of history. It reminds us that power, when not accompanied by responsibility and clarity, always carries the potential to drag people into a spiral of self-destruction. It shows us that the indifference of a society, when faced with injustice or abuse of authority, becomes the fertile ground where the greatest tragedies grow. No disaster ever arrives in an instant. It is nourished quietly by the silence of the crowd, by the erosion of moral judgment, and by countless small decisions that once seemed harmless. But history does more than warn us, it grants us a precious gift, the ability to reflect upon ourselves. When a heartbreaking story from the past moves us, it is not because it is foreign, but because we recognize faint traces of our own era within it. Inequality, power struggles, the exploitation of public trust, these things do not vanish simply because centuries change. They only disguise themselves in new forms, subtler and harder to detect. Therefore, the final message of this story is not merely sorrow for the fate of those long gone, but a reminder that every generation bears the responsibility to examine itself, correct its course, and safeguard its human values. If history is a mirror, then we, the living, are the ones who choose whether to look into it or turn away. Another essential part of the message is empathy. It is easy to judge when reading events steeped in tragedy, easy to declare who was right or wrong when everything has already been resolved. But the people in those stories had no such privilege. They were swept into the currents of their age, constrained by the limits of their society, crushed by invisible pressures, and at times rendered helpless before the machinery of politics. The message of history urges us to understand that to judge an era, we must first understand its people. And to understand them, we need a heart wide enough and a mind deep enough. From this story, we also witness a lesson about the ruthless nature of historical upheavals. Great shifts in history rarely occur peacefully, they bring ruin, division, and often the sacrifice of the innocent. Yet, paradoxically, it is these tragedies that become the material from which later generations mature. Humanity learns more from suffering than from victory. Lessons on morality, freedom, justice, and social responsibility have all been paid for in blood, tears, and shattered lives. Thus, the final message is not merely the conclusion of a story, it is the assertion that history will always repeat itself if we are not vigilant enough to remember. Every collapse begins with small cracks. Every tragedy originates from human pride and blindness. And every hope, no matter how small, can become the starting point for a new cycle of change, if someone is willing to ignite it. To conclude this journey, the most important thing to remember is that history lives only when we allow it to live within our awareness. Every story of the past is a foundational brick in the construction of the world today. We cannot alter what has already happened, but we can change the way we understand, the way we draw lessons, and the way we build the future from those experiences. And that is the final, deepest meaning of 10. The final message, a reminder that every story, whether tragic or glorious, exists to help us become more responsible, more discerning, and more humane. Only when we listen to the echoes of the past can we continue writing a future worthy of the sacrifices that once were made. For history is not only meant to be remembered. It is meant to awaken. As the journey through the turbulent life of Marie Antoinette comes to an end, we find ourselves pausing not only at the tragedy of a queen swept helplessly into the storm of history, but also before a larger question: what truly remains after everything has passed? Her story, with the Fina glimmers of a fading dynasty, the irreversible mistakes, and the legacy that continues to spark debate, offers us an unfiltered glimpse into the ways power, prejudice, and fate intertwine to shape a life both radiant and devastating. And that is also the promise of this channel. Each video is not only meant to ease you gently into sleep, but to bring you closer to the pivotal crossroads of human history. If tonight's story has made you reflect, feel moved, or grow curious about the untold mysteries behind the past, we invite you to stay with us. Ahead lies a vast world of destinies waiting to be uncovered. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment, so we can continue exploring history together, quietly, deeply, and with the most captivating sense of wonder.